Hello and welcome to the Books on Asia podcast, sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years, located at www.stonebridge.com. And I'm your host, Amy Chavez. And today we're talking with Jeffrey Engels, a writer, translator, and professor at Western Michigan University. He's the first non-Japanese poet writing in Japanese to win the Yomiuri Prize for Literature. His translation of The Book of the Dead by Shinobu Orikuchi won the Miyoshi Award and Scaglione Prize for Translation. He's here today to talk to us about his translation of the just-released book by Hiromi Ito called The Thorn Puller. Now, a little bit about author Hiromi Ito. Her book was released in Japan under the Japanese title of Togenuki Jizo, Shin Sugamo Jizo Engi. And she came to national attention in Japan in the 1980s for her groundbreaking poetry on pregnancy, childbirth, and female sexuality. After relocating to the U.S. in the 1990s, she began to write about the immigrant experience and biculturalism. And that really, this immigrant experience and biculturalism really comes out in The Thorn Puller. And that's what we're going to talk about with Jeffrey today. And welcome, Jeffrey.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really delighted to be here.
I just finished The Thorn Puller.
Oh, great.
And it was really, really nice. Now, before we get into it, though, I have to confess that I do know a little bit about you.
Oh.
Because... Well, actually, I'm from Ohio, so I'm not too far away from you in that kind of sense. Oh. But I read your Book of the Dead quite a while ago. And then also I attended the OSU Practice of Literary Translation.
Oh, fantastic.
Online, and I think you moderated that. Yes. That was so much fun.
Oh, good. I'm so glad that you were one of the members there. I thought your name looked familiar, but I didn't place it. So fantastic. It's good to meet you here in this wonderful forum.
Yeah, so here we are, and I was especially excited to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that means a lot to me. I've looked at your podcast many times in the past, and I'm always impressed with the wonderful array of scholars and thinkers that you've got on. So I'm happy to be included in their number.
Yay, yeah, thank you for joining us. Thank you. Can we start off by talking about Monkey and the imprint with Stonebridge Press, and how did this enable you to translate The Thorn Puller, and what is it doing for translation in general?
Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. So let me back up and tell a little bit of history here. In 2008, the Japanese translator of American fiction, Shibata Motoyuki, who's very, very prominent in Japan, started a magazine called Monkey Business. For some time, he had been doing, I think before that, for some time, he had been doing a Japanese magazine called Monkey. In that, he would introduce lots of American fiction in translation to Japanese audiences. And it's a very, very beautiful magazine, really lovely with illustrations, and sold all around the country. Well, Monkey Business was another magazine that was kind of like that, except the reverse. It introduced a lot of Japanese literature to American audiences through translation. And he did this magazine with some of his colleagues for several years. But in 2020, I think that they gave the magazine an overhaul and retitled it Monkey. And it was relaunched as kind of an anthology that we published each year. My understanding was that they decided to do this because the previous incarnation of the work, Monkey Business, was more of a magazine kind of format. And the runs of magazines are a little bit limited for libraries. Magazines always come with a little bit of a to be eaten by this date, kind of date. And so, if the magazines aren't consumed by then, they tend not to attract a lot of attention. So they rebranded Monkey Business as a new anthology that would be published annually. And it's called Monkey. It started out in the year 2020, around the time of the pandemic. At the launch in New York, I believe it was held in New York, they had something like 400 people come, which was really an astounding, wonderful number. And my understanding was that the publisher of Stonebridge Press, Peter Goodman, was there in attendance. And so he approached the editors and said, hey, you guys, you're doing this wonderful work bringing all this fantastic Japanese literature into English. I'm a publisher who specializes in books about Asia, and I'd like to do more fiction. Can we work together? And so they came up with the plan of the Monkey editors kind of encouraging, incubating works that would then be published by Stonebridge Stonebridge Press under a special imprint called Monkey. So that's the Monkey imprint at Stonebridge Press. This is actually the first book to be included in the Monkey imprint. And so I feel really honored that they're launching this imprint, which I hope is going to have a long, wonderful future with this book. The reason that they selected this book was because I had not serialized exactly. I had included a couple of chapters from the book in different issues of Monkey Business and Monkey along the way. And so I think between those magazines, I had probably about 1/3 of the entire book translated. It wasn't, I mean, that was a pretty big step to get going. Ito Hiromi, the author herself, had really strongly encouraged me to do the rest of the work. I loved the book and I really wanted to do it. So I actually started working on the rest of the book on my own, thinking that I would just, send it out to a publisher. But when I mentioned to the editors at Monkey that, I was going ahead and doing the rest of the book, they're like, oh my gosh, well, you got to let us see it. So the rest is history. They selected it as the first book in their imprint, and here the book is, published newly in December 2022.
That's great. Yeah. Well, I felt privileged to be able to get a review copy of it, and it's an interesting book.
Oh, thank you.
I think a lot of, especially female Japanese authors, when we pick up these books, we know that we're going to get something a little different. And that's what's so intriguing about it. I wondered also because, first of all, your translator's introduction is fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
And then when I read how you were thanking her, I thought, oh, so you have this great relationship with the author as well. So can you give our readers a bit of insight as to how that relationship works? I mean, I think a lot of us have this idea of this translator all alone in a room translating by themselves.
Yeah, that's a really rich question. Thank you for that. Let me just say a few words about me and my past and how I got to know her, first of all, because I think that sheds some light on what this whole thing is about. I did my PhD dissertation quite a few years ago. I finished in 2004. I wrote my dissertation about representations of male-male love in modernist literature of the 1910s, 20s, and 1930s. So during that time, I was reading lots and lots of books that were written by men, for men, about men. In the course of reading all of these things one after another, I just felt like it was just inundated with male voices. So during the time that I was working on this and finishing up my dissertation, I was in Japan for research, and I love poetry. So I read poetry like crazy all the time. And a friend of mine suggested, oh my gosh, well, if you like poetry, you have to read this writer, Ito Hiromi, because she's a genius. She doesn't sound like anyone else. So I quickly got her book and I read it. And indeed, this was some of the writing from the 1980s and 1990s that she had done that was so revolutionary in the world of poetry. And it was again, like my friend had said, unlike anything I'd ever read in English or in Japanese. She's such a strong voice. It comes through loud and clear, and she doesn't sound like anyone else. And so I became really intrigued by her. And I became even more intrigued when I realized that she was living in San Diego, living in the United States. I realized that she didn't have any books in translation yet. There were a handful of poems that were translated in various anthologies here and there. But I thought, my gosh, here's a astoundingly interesting poet, living in the United States, and she doesn't have a book in English? How is that possible? That's crazy. Plus, she wrote so much about sexuality, about feminine desire, about childbirth, about pregnancy. And although I'm a man and haven't experienced those things myself, as a gay guy who's very interested in gender studies and was writing a dissertation on gender studies, I really wanted to explore voices like hers, which could tell me about experiences that I hadn't had and wanted to know about. So a couple of years went by, and there was a conference in San Diego, and so I and a couple of my friends very boldly put together a panel that would be all dedicated to the work of Ito Hiromi, and we invited her to come to the presentation. And much to our delight and astonishment, she showed up.
That's an amazing idea.
It was kind of, it was partly a gimmick too, because I think that we all wanted to meet her and we all were fascinated with her. It worked. And afterwards, she took us back to her place. We talked for hours and hours, and I became just completely enamored with her and her work. And so after that, I got the idea that I wanted to work and do a book of her poetry at some point. So in 2009, I published the first collection of her work in English, the first book-length collection called Killing Kanoko, which was a selection of her early work. This included a lot of work that was really controversial and really attracted a lot of critical attention, both positive and negative in Japan, because she talks so forthrightly about many things, including postpartum depression, things that a lot of people in Japan are not especially eager to talk about, feelings that people tend to hide behind kind of, sunny images of motherhood. And
that's what's surprising to me. You'd think that books actually do provide that or should provide that.
It's true. I think it's true. Books should provide that. And I think that that's one of the things that Hiromi realized. Early on, when she was having her own children, she was looking around and she realized that there weren't that many books written about childbirth and pregnancy for women by women. There were plenty of books by medical scholars and men who were talking about the experience of what childbirth was like, but she didn't find anything that was kind of down to earth and really spoke in a kind of bodily, visceral way about female experience. And so she wanted to provide that for her audience, and so she wrote in very, very explicit terms about what those experiences were like for her. And one of the poems, one called Kanoko Goroshi, which was published in the mid-1980s, became a bit of a sensation, translated as Killing Kanoko. And in it, she imagines a mother who has just had a child named Kanoko, who experiences postpartum depression and wants to kill her own child. This was all the more scandalous because, indeed, Hiromi's first child was named Kanoko. And so it seemed extremely autobiographical, even though it was really a work of her imagination. But she quickly got picked up by male critics and pilloried for her willingness to broach this very dangerous, seemingly dangerous subject that kind of violated the pure image of motherhood. Anyway, I think it's an extraordinary piece of writing, and so I was so happy to bring that to an audience. Well, that book did really well, so I followed it up with a second book published in 2016 called Wild Grass on the Riverbank. That was a translation of a book-length poem that she did. And that's a poem that's about a family that's moving to America and experiencing all sorts of dislocations in terms of language, in terms of power, in terms of culture, all sorts of ways. That book found a different kind of audience. It really spoke to a number of people who were very interested in Asian American literature and who hadn't had the opportunity to read Asian American literature that was originally written in Japanese. This book, The Thorn Puller, also touches very much on that same theme. And it was because Wild Grass on the Riverbank hit a nerve with so many people, because it found such a willing audience with so many people. That I really felt like, there needs to be more room in English for Asian American literature like this, that explores in such detail, like what it's like to move across boundaries and, what are all the cultural expectations that come with that.
I really enjoyed that part too, because she grew up in Japan.
Right.
And she spent a lot of her life here. And then she moved to the States. And so that's a different perspective, I think, for Asian American literature, because a lot of it is about being Asian and living in America, but not necessarily, although the roots are Asia, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going back and forth between cultures. And what the Thorn Puller does so well for me is that she's constantly going back and forth between Japan and the US. And so she's taking care of her aged parents in Japan while going back to the US, where she has her children who are one's still in school, and they have their own issues and such. So you really get this sense of back and forth of, being completely displaced each time and having to come to terms with this other culture again.
Yeah, no, that's a very good summary of the book. Thank you for that. When I first read this book, this was a time in my life when, as a young assistant professor, I was going back and forth to Japan all the time. And I really wasn't sure at some point which country I was living in any longer. Even though my situation as an American is very different than hers, this kind of back and forth, very confusing life seemed to make a lot of sense to me. And it was the first time I had found a representation of that in Japanese literature.
Another thing I liked about the book is that she goes back and forth between prose and poetry,
Yes.
quite fluidly. And so that's just a nice aspect. Can you let our readers know a few of the elements that make this Japanese literature, other than just the content? I know the I novel, for example, is, a specific Japanese literature genre. There's a little bit of that in there, right?
Right.
And I was wondering, why do you think that the I novel started? Is it because it offers a form of protection, or is it because it offers a form of creativity, or is it like all of those and more? Or what are your views on that?
I wish that I had some of the work of my friends who are scholars of the I novel here with me to refer to as. But when the I novel started, there was in older Japanese literature, there was a strong tradition of kanzen choaku in writing, which kind of talking about virtues and punishing vice. So there were all kinds of stories in fiction that had a moral element to it. And so that often was, one of the kind of organizing functions of literature, like in the late 19th century, even into the first couple of decades of the 20th century. But as kind of modern Western models of writing were introduced to Japan, they provided just an entirely different way of looking at the world. Not necessarily kind of working through these questions of virtue and vice in the same way. Rather, Japanese Western authors were very interested in questions of interiority. What would it mean to kind of capture the original psychology of a person, and how do we do that? And many of the kind of experimenters with the early I novel realized that it was very difficult for them to talk in a very objective way to really truly capture the interiority of anyone, unless it was themselves. They could study themselves, they could look at themselves and write about themselves without all that much trouble, but it became very difficult to do that about other people. So there was a kind of natural turning with these experiments in the mid-Meiji period, around the turn of the 20th century, with writing psychological novels that were very much about oneself. And honestly, when I've read quite a lot of those I novels, from the 1900s, 1910s, and 1920s, quite a few of them are pretty boring because they're very, very, very much about the small, teeny tiny details of a person's life, what they thought, what they ate, and
more like a diary.
Their sexual feelings. Yeah. Yes, they're kind of shaped into fiction, but they're often very unwieldy and so on. In a way, I would say that this book, The Thorn Puller, is hearkening back to that tradition of the I novel. And in fact, there have been a couple of scholars who've looked at it within that context, talking about it as a book that's, inspired by one's own experience, that's turning to one's own experience for nourishment, and really trying to explore the world through the lens of the self. But Hiromi's take on that is a little bit different than I think a lot of the other people, the older people who are experimenting with it. There is a lot of fictional stuff throughout this book. There are moments when, for instance, the narrative becomes suddenly surreal. She begins to see, things along her route talking to her. She hears the voices of plants. She imagines her friend that she's walking with transforming into a Buddhist image of Jizo, begins to speak to her in that context. So there are definitely these kind of fictional elements in it that can't really be reduced to pure biography. But she definitely draws upon her own experience a great deal and uses it as the stuff of writing in these fantastically clever ways.
I liked the attack of the vaginas.
Oh, yeah.
That was great. That made me laugh. She's got such a good imagination.
I had a fun time translating that. Yeah,
I bet you would have.
Yeah. One of the places where you can kind of see her sort of playing with language and her playing with traditions is in the notes to each chapter.
Oh, yes. I definitely wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah.
At the end of each chapter, there's something called Note from the Author. And can you explain that?
As I said, the book isn't 100% purely autobiographical. She incorporates lots of experiences and lots of stories and lots of quotations from other people all throughout the text. Except what's interesting about them is that she just sort of embeds them in the text without identifying them as quotations. For instance, a famous phrase out of some piece of literature might suddenly be uttered by her narrator, just within its own particular context in the book. But it's actually kind of a quote that she's from somebody else that she's sort of digested, taken it into her own body and kind of reinterprets in her own way. So I think of it a lot like she's swallowing all these ideas from all over the place. And they really kind of make her text, her style rich. She's got it almost seems like there's this polyvocality to the text. It's like all these kind of forces, myths, stories, poems, and so on are speaking through her, kind of shaping her own experience. And those are the things that she mentions in the notes from the author at the end of each chapter. In the Japanese, actually, the Japanese notes are a bit shorter than they are in the English.
I wondered.
In Japanese, she might just say, I borrowed the voice of such and such a person in this chapter, and that's it.
Oh, okay. Because most Japanese people would be able to recognize them. Is that it?
Some of them are definitely extremely recognizable for people that are well read and might be familiar with literature. However, there's a lot of things that are really obscure,
even for Japanese.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in the process of me working on this book, I even found out that she put in an Easter egg or two for the scholar. She included a couple of fake quotes that didn't actually exist in the original text. I won't say which ones, but so she's actually kind of played with scholars, and I think the expectation is that if something looks autobiographical, it's going to be autobiographical.
Right.
But she kind of plays with that a little bit, and so she even plays with her assumption that like the references themselves are going to be necessarily truthful.
I was surprised when I read them after the first chapter. And then it started becoming a game for me, because I have read quite a bit of, I've read the Kojiki and, things like that. And I was getting some of the references, but certainly not all. So I would, when the next chapter came, I'd go to the back and I'd read, okay, I borrowed the voices from, and then I'd look for them when I was reading that chapter.
Right.
And that was fun. But she doesn't do it all the time. I mean, at one point she just, said, the 9th century monk Kukai said that, and something like, you can achieve enlightenment in this lifetime, or what, I forget which quote she said. But so sometimes she drops them in, other times, she doesn't. Now, for your careful readers, I guess there's no reason you have to really even take notice of any of it. Just read it for what it is, and I think it's just as enjoyable. But for people who do like to dissect things and be led down, rabbit holes and such, that was really helpful.
It was definitely a lot of fun. And those quotations, oftentimes they were the places that threw me for a loop, because sometimes, there would be like a kind of shift in logic or a shift in style, a shift in tone. Those shifts in tone are the most difficult thing to capture in translation. Japanese is a really rich language when it comes to words. Just, for instance, even the copula, which means just is or am, you can say that in at least, a dozen ways in Japanese, like des, degozaru, dearu, nari, and so on. And all throughout the text, she uses all these different kinds of stylistics, sometimes in the quotations, sometimes to make herself sound like she's, narrating part of the story in a specific style or whatever. Those kind of stylistic challenges they definitely maybe work my chops as a translator here. So
definitely. And I could feel it too, because there's definitely a stream of consciousness type of aura to her writing. And one of the things I noticed that you did is you used some words that we use in conversation that normally you wouldn't use in text, right? You'd write the written form. Like instead of saying the US, you said the States. Yet the States is really conversational, right? It's not something that it's a little too informal, but because that was in that kind of text, it still retained that stream of consciousness and that kind of and the author talks to the reader. That's kind of fun too.
Yeah.
And she'll put in quotes. Oh, and I know what you're thinking now.
Yeah. One more thing that I should mention here is that she has been influenced for many years, for decades actually, by a type of Japanese storytelling called sekkyobushi, which kind of combines, it's a medieval style of narrative, but it combines poetry and prose, formal classical Japanese, as well as what would at the time would have been more colloquial Japanese. So it's a really kind of hybrid form in which a story is told along with all of its kind of moral implications are drawn out. So she wanted to, when she sat down to write this book, she told me that she wanted to write a modern Seikyobushi, something that kind of defied current notions of genre, something that would kind of move from prose to poetry and back again, that would move between different styles, and that would allow like a plurality of stylistics to join her there on the page. Yeah, she definitely succeeded. I know that from reading Japanese reviews of the book, the book became a bestseller in Japan. One of the reasons that people liked it so much is because they just enjoyed just the sheer funness of the style. It was just so enticing. Another reason, I'm getting a little bit off topic here, but another reason that the book appealed in Japan is because, as you mentioned, one of the major themes of the book is caring for the elderly towards the end of their life.
Right.
In this particular book, the major concern is the aging and rapid failing of her parents, which was happening actually at the time that she wrote the book. That kind of pressure, which is described in so much intimate detail in this book, is something that I think a lot of Japanese readers understood because of the current demographic situation of Japan.
That's right. Yeah.
Because Japan has such a long life expectancy, it has a very gray population with people living into 80s, 90s, sometimes over 100, and in relatively good health. So that means that there are many, many, many people like Hiromi who are already middle-aged themselves or getting up there in years, who are kind of in this difficult position of taking care of their parents who are maybe in their 90s or 100 years old.
Yeah, some people are retired and looking after their parents.
Right. So exactly. So a book that kind of picked this theme up and explored it in so much detail, I think spoke to a lot of people.
For me, that was really one of the most interesting things about the book, because you do hear about people taking care of their parents. And we still do that in the States, not to the same degree, but there are people who have the granny flat and grandpa lives downstairs, that type of thing. And I just always wondered what kind of struggles these people have. And I thought just everything was so interesting about that. And just the type of dog she chose for her parents to keep them company.
Yeah.
And such. And all those things were really key.
Yeah.
And really gave it a real feel. And I enjoyed that. And I also enjoyed her, she talks about going to meet certain people. Oh, we need to bring up the Togenuki Jizo.
Oh, yes, of course.
She talks about going to Sugamo and with, other people and going to visit the Jizo statue and why.
Right.
We need to get to the crux of the story is about this thorn pulling Jizo. Mm-hmm. And the reason he's called the thorn pulling Jizo, correct me if I'm wrong, is that he takes out your suffering, the thorns of your suffering, and people go to him. Is it a hymn? I don't even know. And they pray for solace and to feel better. And many people believe this. And yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And when I was talking to Stephen Mansfield the other day, and I told him I was reading this book, I was like, oh yeah, I'm reading the Thorn Puller, and it's about this Jizo in Sugamo. And he's like, oh, Togenuki Jizo. He knew exactly, what it was. He said, oh, it's such an interesting, statue. And so, or place. And so, yeah, it is well known.
Yeah, it's such an interesting place, as you say. Sugamo, it used to be one of the kind of very working class, kind of more down to earth, parts of Tokyo. Right now, I think a lot of Tokyo has been somewhat homogenized, by modern building and that sort of thing. So I'm not sure that it has the same appeal that it might have had 60, 70 years ago or something like that. And since at least the 1700s, it's had this famous association with the Togenuki Jizo, the thorn pulling Jizo. My understanding, I went to the temple and I got a book about their history, and I read up all about the history of it. And it seems that there was a story, and I'm not going to launch into the great details here, but there was a story in which a girl in the Edo period swallowed a needle. she had some dreams, or something. I can't remember the exact details, but she was told to swallow this little image of Jizo and a little on a piece of paper. When she did, apparently the story goes that she spat up the needle which was then wrapped wrapped in this little image of Jizo.
So that's why they swallow it then now.
Right, right. So there's a tradition at this particular temple. You can go to the temple and buy these little tiny images of Jizo, which you can burn up and like swallow as ash, or you can like roll into a pill and swallow. But the idea is that like by taking Jizo into you, then he'll get at the thorn of suffering or the needle of suffering wherever it is in your body, and will help to remove it.
Wow.
This particular temple like became very famous for this, and it started having pilgrimages. People would come there once a month on pilgrimage days, in huge numbers, and especially the elderly, who I think many have many aches and pains all over their bodies, including some of us, middle-aged people, aches and pains too. I prayed to have a few of those removed. But this became so popular especially amongst the elderly, that closer towards the modern period, they opened it up and started holding the pilgrimage day 3 times a month. And so it's still very popular. If you go on one of those 3 days of the month when the pilgrimage is happening, the place will be just absolutely jammed with people, and you can't even get close to the temple because there's such a big line of people.
Now, can you actually see the Jizo, or is it the temple?
So the Jizo that is the kind of heart of this temple is not actually on display. And the reason is that it is a stamp, I understand. Apparently it was revealed to a monk in a dream that the stamp of Jizo, this little image made of Jizo on paper, would have miraculous powers. And so the Jizo himself like took the form of this stamp, which was then kind of mass produced. So the image of Jizo that is housed there is more like an idea. It's the image that's on this original stamp.
That is so interesting, because Jizo usually is actually an image statuary, right?
Right.
So it's quite interesting. I mean, he's the most visible one in all of Japan. You go anywhere and you see Jizo because he's a protector of children, but also travelers.
Right.
So you'll see him at crossroads, and where, someone will have put a little, Jizo statue with a house, it's underneath a little shelter, and just like knee high or, maybe waist high, and he'll be there protecting the crossroads. And you'll see him along trails, if you walk along the trails in Japan. And so he is very visual. So to go to a place where he's more of an idea, that's Hiromi Ito for you.
That's right. Yeah. There's one kind of funny place in the book where she's talking about the Jizo at the temple, and then she suddenly realizes, hold on a second, I've never even seen him. Like, I don't know if there's a statue of him back there anywhere.
Yeah, and it's her partner who brings it up, and that was hilarious. I liked that part where the partner never really gets Japanese culture, why she's doing these things, and of course she herself has never questioned them,
right.
And she questions them too, but only to a point, right?
Right.
But I thought, having that foreign voice there saying, that's so crazy, or why do you do that, was also interesting. I think anyone who has ever lived in Japan can understand that, and there are definitely people who just don't get it. Don't get the culture, don't want to accept it or be open to it.
It is really interesting. About the same time that I was working on this book, I happened to be reading a book which was written by a fairly well-known geographer by the name of Yifu Chuan. The book is called Space in Place, The Perspective of Experience. And it's a really fantastic book in which he talks about geographical ideas, like what is a space and what is a place, and how do those things differ? In a nutshell, I mean, it's a really influential book, so I recommend it highly. He draws upon lots of examples from all over the world, but he says that a space is a place where we go to and we do stuff. But when we begin to kind of think about that place, it takes on a special kind of role in our imaginations as a place. So a space can become a place, and there are all sorts of different types of spaces and all sorts of different types of places. As I was reading this and thinking about this book, I realized that in certain parts of the book, Sugamo is a space. She goes there,
right.
On when she's in Tokyo, she happens to go through it. Things happen there, things that shape her life and so on. But it also is a place that even when she's far away in southern Japan or San Diego, it gives her life a certain kind of meaning. It gives her a certain kind of anchor. She's able to relate it to the past histories of her family. She remembers her mother and her grandmother going there to worship, and that kind of provides her some method of thinking through her own suffering. Like, well, what will I do when I'm, suffering myself? And so, she kind of, like replicates these rituals in the place that is Sugamo, not just a space, but a place. And so, I thought that distinction between space and place was really interesting here, because most of the story actually takes place in either Kumamoto, southern Japan, or Encinitas, just outside of San Diego in Southern California. And Tokyo actually comes in as kind of like the third place in the book. And actually, relatively little of the book happens there. But it's through kind of like, but it is like the key linchpin that ties together this entire story of all these different kinds of suffering, all, dealing with, the aches and pains of aging, of all the members of her family. Although it's like relatively little of the book happens there, it's the kind of place through which all of her experiences triangulated and given.
It's the nexus.
It's the nexus. Yeah, there we go.
I really wish this conversation could go on forever. I'm just so intrigued by listening to you talk about the book.
Oh, thanks.
And I feel so many of the same things. And now, of course, I want to read everything else. Please continue translating for the rest
absolutely.
of us. But we do have to wrap up. And the last question I always ask my guests is what their 3 favorite books on Japan are. And I know this isn't fair. How can anyone narrow it down to 3? But just 3 books that have either influenced you or you think, never got the attention they deserved, or whatever it is. It could be anything. But I would love to hear what your 3 favorite books on Japan are.
When I found out that you were going to be asking this question, I sat there and scratched my head quite a bit, because I thought, oh my God, how can I possibly limit it to 3? I don't even know where to start. So I thought I would name a couple of books that I read early on in my explorations of Japan and Japanese literature. So books that were historically important to me.
Good.
One of them is the very first book to Japanese literature that I ever read. It was Natsume Soseki's Sanshiro. When I was in high school, I think it was 14, I went to a local bookstore, and there was a stack of books by this writer who I'd never heard of, Natsume Soseki. And I had some Japanese friends. This is before I even went to Japan the first time as a 15-year-old. It was a year before that. I picked it up thinking, ooh, what is this book? And it was such a kind of brilliant exploration of a young person going through their angst-ridden years, looking for themselves in the context of kind of mid-Meiji Japan, right at the early part of the 20th century. And, this was like, I was growing up during the 1980s. And so like Japan was like the economic power that everyone wanted to emulate. And it looked like there was no end to Japanese economic power. So it was such an interesting thing to kind of read about the growing pains of a young man growing up in a very different kind of era of Japan, trying to figure out like what it meant to suddenly be living in a modern country. What was the balance between tradition and modernity? How was Japanese identity being created? This was a revelation to me to realize that like Japanese identity was created. And this was one of the books that helped me understand that. I can't recommend it highly enough. And another book I wanted to mention was Kafu the Scribbler. And this was translated by Edward Seidensticker. And this was one of the first pieces of Japanese literature that I read. It's a biography with an appendix containing translations of the most famous stories of Nagai Kafu.
Oh, right.
And it is a fantastic, first of all, it's a really great biography. And second of all, the stories that he translates are just fantastic. They're so beautiful. And so the first time I went to Japan, like to live and in Tokyo, I took my copy of Kafu the Scribbler with me, and I tried to walk around the neighborhoods, to find anything that was left of that time period, because Nagai Kafu describes like old Tokyo, like earlier incarnations of Tokyo with such beautiful vividness that I felt like I was just walking through the streets myself. One third and final book that I'd like to mention, and this is again because of more historical reasons, John Dower's book, War Without Mercy, Race and Power in the Pacific War. This is kind of a departure from the sorts of things we were talking about, but I read it.
Oh, it's nonfiction, right?
Nonfiction, right. And it's all about World War II and the ways that the war was racialized in both America and Japan.
Right.
And the ways that, ideas about race and prejudice and stereotypes were actively employed in making the war acceptable for domestic audiences.
Exactly. It's an eye-opener.
Right. To me, I had never read anything like it. And it was astounding to me to realize the extent to which, in my innocence, I just simply didn't know the extent to which war and kind of visions of the other were racialized to such an extreme degree. So that was the book that opened my eyes and showed me how race needs to be an important part of any kind of conversation that we're having about power in a nation.
And it teaches us to recognize that, race is everywhere in our, certainly we also have elements of that. We just maybe can't recognize them because,
right.
we think that's normal or have accepted it.
Right.
Someone's book recently brought up the point that, I guess it was Stephen Mansfield's Tokyo, that history is often written in order to justify the actions. It's not necessarily objective.
Right.
And I think we have to remember that because, even the pictures of Hiroshima weren't even allowed to be shown to the public in the U.S. until 30 years later.
Gosh. Yeah.
So we're all subject to it. We think we're all pure and not racist, but absolutely not.
Right.
Yeah. So thanks for that. That's really good. Yeah. So, well, thank you so much for joining us, Jeffrey. And for our listeners, please do pick up a copy of the Thorn Puller. And you'll definitely be in for a wonderful and fun read.
Great.
Take care, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Books on Asia podcast, produced and edited by Amy Chavez and Michael Palmer. Logo by Alex Kerr. The Books on Asia podcast is sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publishing quality books on Japan and Asia for over 30 years. And I'm your podcast host, Amy Chavez, author of Amy's Guide to Best Behavior in Japan and The Widow, the Priest, and the Octopus Hunter, Discovering a Lost Way of Life on a Secluded Japanese Island. For more interviews, book reviews, and other features, visit the Books on Asia website at booksonasia.net.